Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining this live event, lesson 69 of the Java Fundamentals stream, and we continue today our discussion on JDBC. It is the third lesson about JDBC. Maybe we can finish it today, we'll see, but the idea is, if you're watching the event live, don't forget that you have a live chat there, so you can ask me questions directly in the live chat, and if you're watching the event recorded, you can anytime follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and you can write your questions as well in the comment section of the video, and I will discuss with you, of course, and I will try to answer your question as fast as possible, as you've already seen me doing that in the previous couple of years. So with that being said, I will already share you my screen, and you will see that just before going live, I have created a project, a Maven project. I have already created it because well, we have already discussed about Maven and why we need it in the previous couple of lessons, so I guess that's not anymore a mystery for you. Of course, if you are watching this lesson for the first time, it's your first time on this channel, just mind it that this is lesson 69, so it's quite advanced in the Java Fundamentals topic, and this is the third lesson actually about JDBC, so I actually consider you already know why we are using Maven in this third discussion about JDBC, and I'll just continue from where we've left off in the previous lesson. So remember, we were using a database. I told you how to use MySQL Workbench. Anyway, you can use any technology you'd like in terms of SQL, but we were using MySQL, and you see here my MySQL Workbench. We created a database, Java, and inside we created the product table, and in the previous couple of lessons you learned how to insert some records into this table, and we've also managed to work on using a result set in the previous lesson to parse the full table and display everything in the applications console. So we used the plain select, a very short one, just the basic select everything from table. Today we'll start with a refresher on how to use the results set and the select query, but I will just make a select using also a where clause, so that you see that no matter how complex the select query is, you still can use the same Java code you've learned to use in the previous couple of lessons. And then we should discuss about the execute method as well, because we left the execute method for the end, and we've gone through the three very important methods of the statement interface: the execute query, and execute update. And we've used execute update to send the insert, update, or delete queries to our DBMS, and we've used the execute query, as you will also see today, to send the select and get the results set collection from the DBMS. And we discussed also that the execute is the most powerful one, but you should only use that if you have structural or administrative SQL queries, so don't use it for the data. Or if you don't know what kind of query will be sent in, you will send in that case, so also execute is your savior. But if you precisely know what kind of query is, and if it is a query like a select, update, delete, or insert, so any data query, just use one of the appropriate execute query or execute update methods. Don't directly use execute, because being so powerful, it also might imply you adding some vulnerabilities into your application, so you want to avoid that as much as possible. So it's better just to use the methods that can do only the way you need your application to be able to do. Remember, we discussed about that also in the previous couple of lessons, and not only. I have this table already. I will use this table, and I just want to remind you how to write a select query. We will just try to write a query where we select the rows that have a price which is, say, greater than a defined price, which will be sent as a parameter. So let's see if we can do that, and let's go again through the results set and the things we discussed about the results set, and see how that works, and then discuss the execute method. Again, I have already created a project with for the example number 69 for today's lesson. And in the POM XML, you find that I've already added the dependencies I need. In my case, you know that we need The JDBC driver in my case will be of course the MySQL JDBC driver, because I'm using MySQL, but in your case it might be a different JDBC driver if you say you are using a different technology. And of course I've established that I'm using Java 15 because that's how I'm usually going with. It's for using Java, for using the latest version of Java in my examples, as you already know. And with that we should be able to write our example. So I'm starting now with just writing the SQL query I'd like to send to my DBMS, and that will be select everything from product. Let me check its name is product to make sure. So the name of the table is product indeed. But this time I'd like to say where price is greater than, and greater than, sorry. And then you know that for any kind of parameter, because you'll be using prepared statements, you will replace the parameter with a question mark, and then you will define the value that will replace the question mark, and prepare statement will do that for you, so you don't have to worry about the data type or everything. You just have to use the proper method in depending on the data type of course that you are sending, but you don't have to mind about the syntax itself. You just have to set the value for the first, second, third question marks in your query, depending on how many you have. In our case will still be a simple one, having only one parameter, but again, it doesn't matter how many parameters you have, you still can use the same way of working with the JDBC. So that's what I want to tell you. Now, of course, we want to connect to a database. So what I will be doing is I will here be defining as well the URL for connecting to my database, which is JDBC MySQL, in my case localhost, and I'm using the default port 3306, so I don't have to specify the port anymore, and then the name of the database, which is Java. So this way I tell my application to which database it has to connect to which DBMS, and of course which database it needs to select. And then of course we need to use the credentials, the username and the password. And I'm using the default installation which comes with username for the super user root and no password, but I don't have to tell you again that in a real world scenario you should never use the super user root for your application. You always have to have defined a user that has only the needed privileges. We've discussed that also in the previous lessons. And now I will create the connection to the database. So I'm using a try with resources, and I will have to cache the SQL exception. Remember, the SQL exception is very important. If you see examples with JDBC in the OCP exam, because in most of the chapter what we are discussing here is for the OCP exam. Remember to always take into consideration the SQL exception, which is a checked exception, so you need to see it's treated or thrown out of the method if you encounter any example, any question with the JDBC in your OCP exam questions. So in my case, for example, if I want to say get the connection and say I want to use varcon, and then I use the driver manager, get connection, and I specify the URL, of course username and password to get the connection, then I will first of all get a SQL exception. You see, if I go with the mouse over, it tells me that I need to handle the SQL exception. Price will be of number. How to restrict to give only number. If this is present in string, any text can be entered. Not really. So you will actually see that is not precisely as you are saying. Well, let me actually cache the SQL exception, so you will immediately see that when I am using the prepare statement, in my case, I will be forced, however, to use a proper method to send the right value. So in my case, when I define the statement from connection, I define the prepare statement of MySQL, and then what you say is that, well, of MySQL, which of course in this case it should be above, and what you say is that Well, how do I make sure that it doesn't send the string and it sends a number? Where it's actually pretty easy, because when I do use the statement here, the prepare statement, I need to set the parameter, and when I set the parameter, I precisely need to select the proper method to send the data type. So in my case, for example, I know it's a double, so I will make sure that I replace the first question mark with a double. So you see it's definitely setting now as a double, because that's precisely the method I'm choosing. So say the price is double something, price 4, and then to set the price you of course use the method which is according to the data type you are setting. So you cannot set it as a string. If I would try actually to put a string here, it will give me a compilation error, because the set double, it doesn't receive a string as a parameter. So yeah, that's how you of course have to program your application according to the data types you set in your application. Hope this answers your question. And of course we set the parameter, and once we've set the parameter, we execute query, and then you know that here we get the result set. So I will set it as a var here, but you see it's a result set. I just use var, not necessarily because I like very much to use var. I'm definitely using, in a lot of cases, I'm avoiding using var. For example, in a real world scenario, it's probably even better to use a result set here and not var. So write it like this, because it's easier for the eye and the mind to see and understand there that the result set, that the rs variable is of a type result set, than if I use a var, where of course IntelliJ is nice enough with me and it shows me the type of the variable, but it's not the case of all the IDEs. And the reason why I actually use var here is because I've seen that starting with Java 11 in the OCP exam, var is very often encountered. So I want you to get used to seeing the var word for the definition of local variables, because you might get a chance to see in plenty of OCP questions the word. So I don't want you to get scared that you see the word or consider it illegal or somehow. I want you to be used with the var word if you are attending the OCP 11 exam, because in the OCP 11 exam you will find var here and there pretty often, so you have to be used with it. But be careful that in real world scenarios, in production ready applications, using var word absolutely everywhere is not necessarily a good choice. So you generally use the var word where it's appropriate, where it's easy to see and identify the type of the variable without needing to see it in front of your eyes, and where of course it spares more characters, because in my case, if I say var instead of result set, you see I don't do a big deal, because I'm just maybe sparing 7 characters or 6 characters. It's not so many. But when you have some kind of collection with a generic type that has another generic type and it's longer and it has that symbols for the generic types which are difficult to read and they can be disturbing to the eye and for the reading, then replacing that with a var might be a good idea. But just take that advice from myself. Just don't use var absolutely everywhere. When I'm using it in the examples, I'm just using it for the Java Fundamentals course to make you used, let's say, with seeing it in the code, because you will see it in your OCP 11 exam questions. Now that we have the result set, remember that the result set is an iterator collection, which means that you have to consider that the result set has this iterator which is always starting from before the first row. So that's why to actually parse a table, you need first of all to move the iterator on the next row, and in case the result set is not empty and there is a first row, then when you call rs next, then the iterator will go from the from before the first row to the first row. And if I use a while here, as you've seen me working in the previous lesson, then you will basically move the iterator through each and every row for every iteration. So for every time the curly braces of the while loop execute, up to the point where the iterator goes beyond the last row of the table. And in that case, next, you see I could use it as a condition of the while. It means that it returns a boolean value, and it indeed returns a boolean value. It actually returns true if the iterator was moved on a row, and it returns false in case the iterator was moved outside of the table. So when the iterator goes beyond the last row of the table, this one will return false, and then the while loop will end. So as I've shown you in the previous lesson, and I will show it to you again. So you have something like this. Just imagine that my arrow here is the iterator, and that's what happens before you call next. Just after you've taken it with execute query, you get the result set, and you have the iterator just before the first row. So if you want to take the value here of the row, you have first to move the iterator to the next row, and that's what next does. So when you call next, if there is a row, it will move the arrow on the next row and will return true when there is a row. So now when you are with the arrow on a specific row, you can access any of these values from here. So for example, if I want to take the ID, I just say get int, and you can either use the overloaded method that takes an int representing the index of the column, or you can directly specify the name of the column. And I do recommend you specify the name of the column, because at least in real world scenarios, it's much easier to see precisely what is the getInt taking the value, where is the getInt taking the value from, and that makes your application a little bit more maintainable. So my recommendation is to use the getInt with the column label, with the column name, instead of using the column index wherever it's possible. So then of course you have the name of the product, and of course every time you have to be careful and use the proper method here. For example, in my case, getString will be because the name is a string and has been defined in the database as a varchar. And then double price, double price. By the way, this double price here, this is something that you'll often see in examples, but be very careful with double. In case of Java, in real world scenarios, in applications, avoid using double. Use big decimal instead, because using double, well, the way it works, the way double works in Java, and I think we might have discussed this in a previous lesson as well, is that it doesn't really take a lot of care of your precision of the decimal. So when you do certain operations like addition, multiplication, division, and so on, you might find out that you might lose a decimal, like instead of say 343, you will find out if you get 342. That's because of the way Java stores the value in the memory. So it's a technical issue. It's actually not an issue, it's known, the behavior is a known one, and is accepted, but that's why in terms of using decimals, make sure that if you use double, it's not some kind of a value that you really want to get all the decimals precisely every time, because it happens with double that you can lose precision. So if there is something like a value that's very important, which usually a price is, use a big decimal instead in a real world scenario. So you will see often double used in examples because it's simple, but it's usually something you need to avoid in a real world scenario. So yeah, I already have a price. Let's call this price value here, so that we can get the price here in a variable named price. And then what I want to do is system out it in the console. So let's see if our application works the way I defined it now. Name, space, and the price. And that's basically it, and it's the same example, almost the same example with ended our previous lesson with, just that now I've used also a condition-aware clause here on my select, just because I wanted to show you that you can literally send any select query. So you can send, it's the same Java code you will use for a shorter select as for a longer select. It doesn't matter if it's 1 line long or 100 lines long. Of course, I don't recommend you have queries of 100 lines long, but I've seen that in production applications. Sometimes people really like to put all their business logic in the select. I'm not really the person to agree that, but that's not something we discussed now. Let's keep our discussion only on the technical aspects that are related to the Java fundamentals. So again, it doesn't matter how long the query is, you still use the same Java code. Or you might have more parameters, you might have no parameters. That's of course depending on your query, but it's not a problem. So double ID primitive, but big decimal is object, the performance will be slow. We discussed here about Java. How much do you think in a Java application that's anyway not natively executed will make a difference between using a primitive and an object? So I bet that you cannot even calculate that in milliseconds. So I would say, yeah, maybe it will be slow, but it will be that small the difference that you cannot even calculate it. Remember that Java applications are anyway not native, so you don't actually use an application in Java to measure its performance up to the point of nanosecond, just because anyway the Java virtual machine adds latencies that are longer than that, so you don't really care if it's a difference between using big decimal and double. But of course you will care in some cases if the price is not the one that you need. So yeah, if you use double instead of big decimal, you won't get a better performance, or at least an observable better performance, but you might have the chance that you get wrong values. And for some applications getting wrong values, it's not really an option. So big decimal, it's a good option in this case. Cool. I hope that answered your question as well. So, and now let's actually run our example, make sure it works, and then try to run also an application in which we will use the execute, so that we just see. So of course, if I run this application now, I only get 3 values, because you see, indeed, only 3 of them have a price that's greater than 4. You see, these were my values here, and only the 3 actually have a value that's greater than 4. So what happened here? Very simple. First of all, the cursor was somewhere before the first row, and then you called the next moved the iterator on the first row and returned true, and then you got the ID 1, you got the name beer, you got the price 5. Everything was printed out in the console. While loop ends, goes back to the condition, runs next again. When it runs next again, the iterator goes now on the second row, and next returns true because there was a row, so the iterator was actually moved on a row. So it takes again the ID, it takes again the price, the name, the price, and then it prints out in the console everything. And then of course it returns, it calls again next moves the iterator on the third row of the result. It takes again the ID, the beer, the name beer, and the price 5. It prints them into the console. This is the third row, and then it ends the loop. It goes back to the next condition. The next will move now my arrow after the last row and returns a false, because when the iterator is moved outside of the result, then next returns false, and because next returns false, okay, of course the while loop ended, and then the resources have been as well closed, and the program ended as well. So that's why in the end what you get is the result you expected. Beer 1, beer 5, 2, beer 5, and 3, beer 5. The ID, name, and the prices of the 3 records we have in the database here that have a price that's greater than the value you've given 4. And of course, if you change this into a 3, then you will get other records as well, because now the parameter allows the select query to get more records from your database. And now you will also see the chocolates, because yeah, the chocolates are also according to the condition you specified here. Then yeah, they have the price 4, which is indeed greater than 3. Cool, so this is it. Now in case of the execute method, let's also try a second example here and discuss the execute method. So example 2, and I have a main method, and allow me copy the parameters from here, just because I don't want them to I don't want to write them again. And I will just write a query. Well, it doesn't really matter which query it is, but say it's a delete. Sorry, delete from product where name equals something. So let's say we want to delete some specific records from the database. So what does it happen if we use the execute update for the beginning, and what does it happen when we use the execute method, the simple execute method? Let's try first with using execute update, and we want to see which is the value returned by the execute update method. If you were attentive in the previous lesson, you know that execute update returns an int, and that int value represents the number of records that has been affected by the query you sent. So in our case, con will be driver manager, get connection for the 3, and then you have a statement which will be con prepare statement for my query. And then of course we need to treat the SQL exception, which is a checked exception, so you mandatory have to treat it. And then I say statement set string, and for the value of the first parameter, which is also my only parameter, I will give beers. So let me see here. I do have 3 beers in my database, and then this time I'm calling execute update, and I'm getting back the int n, and I'm printing this in the console. So guess what will be the value for n in our case? Well, we have 3 records that will be deleted. We have 3 records with the name beer, so what we expect is n is also 3, because the execute update method returns the number of records that are affected. In our case, they are the number of records that are deleted. Is DB port number not mandatory in the URL? No, it's not mandatory as long as you use the default one. So for me it's 3306, and 3306 is actually the default number, the default port number for MySQL. So if I'm going here into the XAMPP control panel, you can see that indeed MySQL is started on port 3306. Being that this is the default port, I'm not it's not mandatory for me to set it explicitly in the URL. If I would have changed the port and I didn't have the default one, then I would have needed to add it to the URL as well. But as long as I'm using the default one, then I can avoid specifying it. It's fine. The same applies for any technology that you are using. So if you use the default port of your technology, it's not mandatory to set it into the URL. Cool. So I'm just running example 2 now, and I want to see the result. And I want to see both the result that I get in the console, that is 3 indeed. So my expectation was right, because I know now that 3 records have been affected by my query execution. and I'm going to reselect the rows here in my database, and I see that all the beers disappeared. So yeah, that's fine. It really means that in this case we've managed to delete all the records with the name beer, as well as taking the number that represents the number of rows, the number of records affected by that specific query. The port itself, the question is it irrespective to the DB type? I'm using Postgres in my local. So the difference is, of course, the port itself. Depending on the technology you are using, the port might be different. The default port might be different. If you are using the default port of your technology, it's not mandatory that you set it in the URL. If you are not using a default port, then you need to specify the port in the URL. That's the general rule for that. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually change this and instead use execute. So you remember that execute basically doesn't return an int, but it actually returns a boolean value. And remember, we discussed in the previous lesson that if you get true, that means a select has been executed. If you get a false, it means that it's not a select. So in my case, I changed this, let's call it now result. And we know, of course, it's not a select, so it's definitely this will return a false here, because we are sending a delete. And say that you want to delete now all the candy. So I don't want any more candy, I just want the chocolate to stay here in my database. So I want to remove all the candy. So I know in this case, if I print the result, I know that this will print out false in the console because I'm sending a delete. So I sent something that's different than a select query. And the statement itself, from the statement itself, you can get some of the things you might want to see. For example, if it is a select, not my case, but it would have been a select, you can test the returned value, the value returned by the execute method, and then you can actually still get the result set that has been executed, even though now this is different from the way, it's a little bit more difficult from than the way we've been using it in the first example, where you see by using execute query, it knows that you definitely have sent a select, because the execute query doesn't work with something else. It only works with select queries, so it definitely directly returns you the result set. But if you have used execute, you don't know what is the query you've been using. So if it is a select, then the result would be true, and then you can get the result set just by calling statement get result set in this case. So if, say, you have a scenario in which you don't know what will be sent, if it is a select or not, you can still get, if it's a select, the result set, but you have to explicitly take it using the get result set in this case. And I'm not sure precisely which that is, but if it's the fetch size or some other parameter, but there is also a method that gives you the value of the rows that have been affected. Anyway, we don't necessarily care. I just want to show you that the execute will return here a false and will execute the query. And remember that you can use execute not only for data queries, you can use it for structural queries as well, and you can use it for also for administrative queries. So even for administrative queries, that's why it's not recommended it's recommended you use it as a less concern. So just use execute if you don't have any other choice. If you know for sure that what you're using is a select, then do use directly the execute query. If you know that it's an insert, update, or delete, then you can directly use the execute update method. So execute should always be the last concern in an app. Let's see if the candy also has been deleted. So you see that I have refreshed now and the candy records disappeared from here. That's because of course we deleted them. And with this being said, we've managed to go through all three important methods of the statement/prepared statement interfaces, and that those were execute, execute update, and execute query. And you learned how to send any kind of query to your database management system, and you've also learned how to parse a result set, which is in most of the cases the all the important essential things you need to know for working with JDBC. At least what's not a detail, say basic things and the things that you find in your OCP 11 exam questions. Now, the examples that we do are generally simple, and they are only examples according to what I expect you to find in the OCP 11 exam. But generally remember that this driver manager get connection, it's something you will only see in examples. Don't use this in real world scenarios. In case of a real world scenario, it's recommended you use a data source. Data source is an object that manages multiple connections, and usually in a real world scenario we use something that's called a pooled data source. Data source that's using a connection pool, which means that it's reserving more connections from the DBMS and is managing those connections, serving those connections for when they are required for some specific execution. So this driver manager get connection, it simply gets a connection based on the three values that you see here on the credentials and the URL, and then at the end, because you see here the connection is a resource, that's why I've been able to use it as in between the round parentheses of the try catch block, which will call the close method at the end automatically and will return the connection. But in a real world scenario, that's not really efficient, because it actually means that every time you have to get a connection from the DBMS and then close the connection at the end. And if you would choose to use in a real world scenario this approach, then you would spend a lot of time, and it will be a lot your performance or the performance of the application will be a lot affected by this. Okay, good question. That was the next thing I was actually wanting to tell you about working with the JDBC. One of the important things besides the data source is that you might have observed here that I'm not using transactions. That's because in case of the JDBC, the transactions have to be manually manually managed. So in my case, I'm now just using the default approach of my DBMS, which is the transaction, operation is auto-committed, which means for each operation I have, it automatically creates a transaction, and that will be for each and every operation, for each and every query I send. But I know what you might be thinking now. That's not a real good approach in a real world scenario where you definitely might have more operations, and then what you want to do is to make those operations atomic, like put them in a transaction. For those of you who don't know what a transaction is a set of operations or a set of modifiable operations, we could say, that have a start, and if any of these operations fail, then the transaction reverts basically everything that has been done, such as the data will come back at the way it looked like at the end, at the beginning of the transaction. But if you want to do that with JDBC, then you will have to manually do that, and I don't have plenty of time now, but in the next lesson what I will show you is, first of all, how to extract all this into a separate class, so that you don't have to every time repeat the connection details, which anyway in a real world scenario should come from an external file or resource or so on. I will show you how to implement, say, your very simple dummy connection manager. And to make things even better, we will try to write an application, a full application that does two or three or maybe 4 small use cases, like adding something into a table, searching something into a table, something like that. Maybe using the console, maybe using a very small desktop, a very simple desktop interface. You will see. I would go to a console because I don't want you to focus on 2 different things at the same time, but we can use a GUI as well. It's not a problem. And then at that time I will show you also how to start and then commit or roll back a transaction on JDBC. Fortunately, this is not something that I've seen in the OCP 11 exam or in the OCP questions in general. I didn't see transactions being discussed and examples with transactions in these questions. I'm not sure if something changed meanwhile since last time when I took this exam, but for a long time at least they haven't been there, so I'm pretty sure that still there are very small chances you will get into transactions in the OCP exam. But anyway, now that we have managed to discuss everything about JDBC, everything meaning the basics, of course, because yeah, I didn't discuss all the methods of the prepare statement, result set, and so on, and you don't need that because yeah, of course, even if I would say, I don't know them by heart anyway, but if I would tell you now all these methods, it doesn't make any sense. You'll probably not remember them. I only need you to remember the important, relevant, essential things, and all the others you'll anytime find a way to use them afterwards. You don't need to learn them from the very beginning. You don't need to learn everything. No developer in this world know everything by heart. But with what you know now, which is the basics of JDBC, we'll be able in the next lesson to work on a small application. And I will teach you some more things related to JDBC, that one of them is using transactions. And I will teach you also about the, say, standard class designs that you find in real world scenarios, which will be useful for you when starting with an application framework like Spring. And I do recommend you after this Java Fundamentals stream, you start, if you haven't already, with an application framework. And I recommend you Spring for the beginning. You can't mistake, you can't fail with Spring. Spring will be there from now on many years, so learning it's a good option. There, when you will then find it, and we'll discuss about what a repository is, what a service is, what a manager is, and so on and so forth. You will remember that we've already discussed it in an example only with Java Fundamentals, and you'll see that with an application framework you actually use the same components for your class design, and just that with an application framework it's easier to implement them. It's much more easier to implement them. But now that you know how to do it with, say, Java Fundamentals, then I will show you a nice class design, and maybe we can even work on discussing how application frameworks work in general, and we can actually implement as our very, very small inversion of control container, and that will leverage you and will give you a start for your path, for your road on learning further application frameworks and working on enterprise applications. Good, because now we don't have any more time. We have a very few time left, and we've already discussed the basics, and I don't want to start with something without being to end it. I will leave this for the next lesson. but I'm promised to come back and discuss with you everything I've promised now to do, and to discuss all these things. Thank you very much up to then for being here with me again, and next time let's continue our discussion and write a full application using JDBC and a lot of stuff from the Java Fundamentals stream that you've learned during all these lessons. Have a great time!